Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Just sleepier day than usual on Wall Street on this summer Friday, but not necessarily a sleepy day when it comes to politics here in Washington. Certainly when it comes to a story that has been dominating the headlines over the course of the last week and change, President Trump under increasing pressure from his base around the case of disgraced and convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, who of course died in prison years ago. A sequence of events happened yesterday. First, of course, a Wall Street Journal report was published alleging that President Trump, before he was president, sent a suggestive letter to Jeffrey Epstein for his 50th birthday. The president calls that letter fake and is threatening to sue the Wall Street Journal over that story. But after that story was published, Tyler, he has now authorized the Justice Department to ask for courts to release the grand jury testimony from the prosecution of Epstein, seemingly acquiescing a bit to some of this mounting pressure.
Right. And it's probably worth pointing out that the Justice Department and the FBI last week said that Epstein did not keep a client list and that no more files related to the case would be made public. And that's where we want to start today's segment, bringing in some of our Bloomberg News reporters and editors, Wendy Benjaminson, Bloomberg senior editor, who's live with us here in our D.C. studio, and Ava-Benny Morrison, Bloomberg News legal reporter. Ava, I want to start with you because there have been various efforts in the past to get Epstein-related documents unsealed. Is this time going to be any different? What are we actually expecting to get out of this authorization that the president has appeared to grant?
Look, it's certainly not going to be easy. There will be a number of legal maneuvers that the Justice Department or Bondi's office have to jump through. What happens in the grand jury room is traditionally sacrosanct. It's not as easy as asking a judge to unseal troves and troves of testimony that was given during those secret proceedings. We're talking about potential victims, witnesses, making claims that may have been unsubstantiated. So even if the Justice Department makes a move to have some of these materials unsealed, I expect it's going to be a very lengthy process.
Well, so if the process takes a long time and might not have the end result that some of the president's supporters who are pushing for more transparency around Epstein would want to get, Wendy, is this just giving the president cover essentially to say, well, at least I tried?
It is, and it is a fig leaf, and it's about the size of a fig leaf because the other files, the ones that Pam Bondi said, we now believe this not to be true, the client list that was on her desk, that now she says, no, it was just the files that were on my desk. In those files, not only is grand jury testimony, but it's witness interviews. It's Ghislaine Maxwell, his partner's phone records, and she wore a wire at a time. So there are those transcripts. So there's, for the people who really, really want this to come out, this is just the tip of the iceberg and probably will only, when it's released, only create appetite for more.
Right. So, Ava, to actually build off that, when Pam Bondi did release some of these files earlier this year, it was considered to be a letdown for many conservatives that were seeking more information here. Can you just put into context just how much information these opponents that want to get more, how much are they looking for? Like, what's ultimately some of the end goals here from the people that want to see additional files released?
There's certainly been feverish interest in anything to do with Jeffrey Epstein and a feeling, particularly among Trump's conservative base, that there is information the public doesn't know about and they do deserve to know about it. But over the years, through various criminal cases, as Wendy had mentioned, involving Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein himself, and civil litigation involving the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, we have seen dribs and drabs of information come out that have given us a bit of a insight into the breadth of Jeffrey Epstein's network, who he spoke to, who he associated with, and even people who have been accused of participating in some of his crimes. So I think, the recent calls, what people are really after here is this so-called client list. And as you mentioned, the statements coming out of the Justice Department and Bondi's office that this client list doesn't exist, and it seems to be a little bit of a red herring. And certainly from the people that I've spoken to who have been involved in these cases for many, many years, there is no client list. So I don't know exactly what they're hoping to get out of this grand jury testimony. I would also note that there will probably be a number of objections from people who participated in these proceedings and went in thinking that their testimony was going to be kept secret.
That's a good point. Wendy, I want to return to the point you were making about what could be done to appetite if they're given a taste of something more. They may just want even more information, and this is a story that could keep feeding into itself. President Trump, as we know, is a master of cultivating the narrative he wants to talk about, making sure we're not talking about things he doesn't want to talk about. Right. That is not true this time, and I wonder what you think that tells us.
Well, you're absolutely right, Kailey. He can always adjust the flow of news to suit his agenda. The problem in this case, though, is that there are things that are helping him now shape that narrative. So it may not be the horror that it seems to be for him right now, or that he would lose his base. Because right now he has rallied a lot of MAGA supporters against the Wall Street Journal for the story they had last night, saying it was fake news, as you pointed out. And then also, it's the Democrats trying to seize upon this. And if I were a Democratic consultant, I would say, don't help. There is a long-standing political adage that if your opponent is drowning, let him. Like, don't jump in to help, because now MAGA world can say, oh, it's the Democrats who want it. I don't want to be aligned with the Democrats.
And that's what President Trump is saying. If Democrats have such a big problem, why didn't they release the files during the Biden administration?
Exactly. So they're feeding into helping him sort of take the narrative back. But it won't be solved by the grand jury testimony, but it may solve itself in the end.
Well, I'm wondering how you also think Congress is now potentially playing a role in this, as they're trying to get lawmakers on the record to vote for the full files to be released. And you have that sort of becoming a bipartisan movement, right? Ro Khanna teaming up with Thomas Massie, who yesterday told reporters that they don't want to let the pressure up.
That's true. They don't. And I don't know, however, if you can get 216 Republicans or 219 Republicans to agree to it. And Mike Johnson and J.D. Vance, of course, will put a big full court press on them to back off that effort. But we'll see what happens.
Well, and legally speaking, Ava, how much can Congress actually control the conduct of the Department of Justice from here, and what information actually will ultimately be released? How do we think about the power dynamics between these two branches of government?
I think it really comes down to what is allowable under federal law, and it will be the ultimate decision of a federal judge whether he or she decides to unseal this material. This is certainly a rare occurrence. You don't often see the Justice Department going to a federal judge and saying, can you please unseal what is meant to be secret grand jury testimony? So I think that I don't know how much weight Congress will play here because the judicial branch is completely separate, and it will come down to what is allowable under federal law and the decision of a federal judge.
Well, Ava, just to put a bow on this in our final minute, I know that you have noted that some evidence was successfully unsealed in a Florida state case. Can you just give us a little bit more background here on what successfully has come forward already when it comes to this case?
Sure. So this was a little bit different because it was a county case in Florida involving allegations that Jeffrey Epstein had engaged with child prostitution, and there were some records that were unsealed successfully there last year, and involving grand jury testimony of people that worked in Epstein's Palm Beach house down there. So that is an example of where it has been successful, but I don't think we can apply the same model here because they are different jurisdictions.
All right, Ava-Benny Morrison, Bloomberg legal reporter, and Bloomberg senior editor Wendy Benjaminson joining us on what is an incredible story dominating the narrative here in Washington.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Republican Congressman Bill Huizenga, representing Michigan's 4th District. Welcome back to Bloomberg TV and Radio, Congressman. Nice to see you in person.
Good to be with you, yeah.
As well. It's been a big week in your chamber. It's going to be a big day.
Yeah, this week has been a hell of a month, I tell you.
Yeah, maybe it should have been reframed as crypto marathon rather than crypto week.
It was something else. But, look, a lot of us have been involved in this for a very long time. And I understand that this might be hitting some of our colleagues a little fresher than certainly what those of us who have been diving into this for a number of years have been having to wrestle with. But this is an important statement for us with the Genius Act. Was it my first choice? No, the House was my first choice, a House version of that. But very satisfied with where we ended up on Genius. And my family's involved in construction back in Michigan. And we build houses, and the first thing you do is you pour the walls and the footings. That's the foundation, literally, and then you go from there. And I think that's what we're going to be working on next.
Well, to build off of this, we're talking about the Genius Act.
Unintended on the build off of it.
Well, you're talking about the Genius Act and perhaps some of the changes that you didn't want to see made. But let's talk also about the Clarity Act, because now that heads to the Senate. What's your message to colleagues in that chamber when it comes to keeping that legislation perhaps as it is?
Yeah, well, we think it's a good product. We certainly wouldn't have put it forward if we didn't. And again, a lot of time and effort has been put into this. And I get it. There's a lot of folks that are getting educated at a level that they maybe necessarily hadn't been at previously. And I'm not saying that about Senate banking or anything like that. I'm talking about general colleagues that have to then go out and vote for these things. But we think it's a very good, solid product that Chairman Hill and Stile and a number of us and others, Barr, that have been working on this, Warren Davidson. These are folks that have been really doing the heavy lifting over a number of years. And then obviously over on the Senate side, we have colleagues that have done that as well. And so hopefully we're going to be able to come together. I hope that they lightly edit the House version of that. But it is essential, though, that we not stop. And it's key that we keep moving forward with this because we have to add the infrastructure, the plumbing on all of this.
Well, and of course, the Clarity Act is supposed to divvy up authority between the SEC and the CFTC. Yeah. And the new SEC chair, Paul Atkins, actually joined our colleagues on Bloomberg Surveillance earlier today talking about how he's viewing this specifically. This is what he said.
We are out to, obviously change direction at the SEC, and I think we've already done that. We're moving away from regulation through enforcement and uncertainty in the markets, especially with respect to cryptocurrencies and digital assets in general. And we're looking to set firm, clear rules of the road for people who are operating in that environment.
I wonder about the sense of urgency here, knowing that the SEC now is far less adversarial, shall we say, to this industry. Is there as much urgency in trying to make sure that the CFTC gets more authority over these assets?
Well, look, you got to go back and look at what had happened previously under Gary Gensler, right? And of course, when he was head of the CFTC, everything was a commodity. And when he became head of the SEC, everything magically became a security. And the simple truth is that these things are not either fish or fowl. I always say it's a platypus. It's got characteristics of both in many ways. And it's up to Paul Atkins, as well as the legislation that we're passing, to compel them to come up with what those rules of the road are. And what we saw in the last administration was basically Chair Gensler just making it up as he was going along. And that's not acceptable because it doesn't give predictability. It doesn't give surety of a direction. And I've got great confidence in Paul Atkins and in what he's going to be doing on that. But again, we can't just sit back and say, okay, we declare victory. We don't have to do anything more. This is really just that first step.
I want to drill down a little bit on the bill that we're seeing signed into law today. When it comes to the Genius Act, stablecoins, we have this great story out on the terminal today from actually our colleagues at Bloomberg Government that says that everyone's going to rush to register But the thing is, when it comes to the OCC, the comptroller of the currency, where everyone's going to be going, they're facing actually a shrinking workforce. There are DOGE cuts that have hit the agency. Do you think that there is bandwidth among our regulators to meet what is expected to be this surge in demand? Yeah,
in general, I do. I think that the regulators have to make sure they are prioritizing what their actions are as well. That would be the argument many of us have had over the last 4 years. We've wandered far afield from where those regulators should be. And they were into whether it was ESG and into all kinds of other things that were not necessarily about materiality. They weren't necessarily about safety and soundness and consumer protection. And so, again, I think if they focus in, we're going to be fine on them being able to do that. Is there going to be this bump coming in? Of course. I mean, there's a lot of pent-up demand. And frankly, not many people bought the idea of just come in and register over the last 4 years and all will be fine. I mean, that they didn't buy that. So there's a lot of people that were holding back, waiting for this moment so that we could get that clarity. And this is good for the U.S. dollar. It's good for our preeminence in the world. It adds to the safety and soundness of not just our currency and our money, but for those that are doing the investing. It makes it, not frictionless, but less friction in transactions. So I think this is going to be good for the economy as well.
Well, when we consider the safety and soundness and the credibility of the U.S. economy, monetary policy and its credibility also plays a role there. And I ask you this as the vice chair of the House Financial Services Committee. It's one thing for President Trump to suggest he'd like to see lower interest rates. It's another for administration officials to actively be pushing for the chair of the Federal Reserve to resign, suggesting he should be investigated for fraud. Do you see risk here of doing what could be permanent damage to the Fed's independence and therefore credibility by extension?
Well, I believe in an independent Fed that is important now. As Chair Hill yesterday, when he was asked about this in a press conference, started
None of
going.
You can avoid it, can you?
But he started going through the litany of what was going on with LBJ and with Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and others. Jimmy Carter. I mean, there's been plenty of pressure that has been applied to the Fed and Fed chairs and Fed officials over the decades, and because they are independent doesn't mean that they are somehow absent of any criticism or absent of any critique. And I think as we've seen a few folks sort of breathlessly say, the Fed chair is going to get fired, the president's going to do this. He himself addressed that, walked that back to add clarity to make sure that wasn't happening. And look, his term is going to be up soon. That's going to be the opportunity in my mind where the president's going to be able to really assert himself. Now, does it mean that he needs to do a better job? Yes.
All right, we'll leave it there. Congressman, Thank you so much for joining us. The Vice Chair of the House Financial Services Committee, Congressman representing Michigan's 4th District, Bill Huizenga, here with us in studio on Balance of Power, live from Washington, D.C. I'm Kailey Leinz alongside Tyler Kendall, and we'll have more straight ahead here.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
There's really only one story that everyone is talking about on this Friday, and it's perhaps not the story President Trump would prefer we be discussing, but it, of course, is the push within his base for the release of more information related to the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein, with questions not just about the case itself and whether or not there is a client list that officials within the Trump administration had previously suggested did exist, but also into the president's relationship with Epstein, as the Wall Street Journal published a report alleging that President Trump sent a suggestive letter to Epstein for his 50th birthday, a report that the president denies is called defamatory and has threatened to sue the Wall Street Journal over. But he's also pointing a finger today, Tyler, at Democrats, or I guess, this is today, earlier this morning on Truth Social, saying if there was a smoking gun on Epstein, why didn't the Dems, who controlled the files for 4 years and had Garland and Comey in charge, use it? He ends it, all caps, because they had nothing.
Right. This is part of the White House's defense here, since this story really does seem to have that sticking power. We're now seeing a movement in Congress even to force a formal vote on releasing these files, as it really does appear to have this grip on really both sides of the party here, and that's perhaps becoming a political liability for the president. And that's where we want to start today by bringing in our political panel. It includes Rick Davis, partner at Stonecourt Capital and a Bloomberg Politics contributor, and Christina Greer, associate chair at the Department of Political Science at Fordham. Rick, I want to start with you because where do we go from here? We have President Trump granting this authorization, but it's unclear if a federal court would even grant the administration's request. Could that potentially throw a wrench in the administration's plan, since they appear to be wanting to give those that are seeking more information something to chew on?
Yeah, I almost think that that's what the White House wants, right? Is so that they can wake up and then start attacking the judiciary again, saying, oh, well, I wanted you to have this information, but the courts won't let you have it. Of course, I don't think it was a coincidence that they went after the most sensitive information you can have, which is grand jury testimony, which is supposed to remain secret. Forget the files you already have at the FBI and in the Justice Department that can be released tomorrow. So look, Biden didn't release this stuff for some reason, and Trump doesn't want to release this stuff for some reason. My guess is there may be not much to it all, and that the only reason the president has actually bowed to this effort is by his own claim is because the publicity was bad for him. And so all he's done is kept the publicity going into this weekend. So we'll have a nice, thorough Sunday show, spectacular, with more Jeffrey Epstein, and who knows? Now everybody's got an investigative journalist looking for more Epstein material like the Wall Street Journal came up with. I mean, it is a classic summer scandal.
Indeed. And we are in mid-July. As we consider, though, Christina, the sentiment around this, obviously there are loud voices that have always been loud voices within the MAGA base who have made a very big deal about this, thinking of the likes of Laura Loomer. But there's another question of the broader Republican electorate. We've gotten a few polls this week, one from Quinnipiac, that shows there is some division among Republicans on this issue. 40% say they approve of the way the administration is handling the Epstein files. 36% disapprove, 24% did not give an opinion. There were similar divisions in a Reuters Ipsos poll. 35% approve of the handling, 29% disapprove. Is the fracturing of the Republican, or more specifically the president's base, a real tangible thing here?
Well, it appears that this is the first time we've seen real fissures within the base. I mean, this is also a base that's been fed a consistent diet of conspiracy theories that the president has sort of promoted and then walked away from. We can start with the birther conspiracy theory, and then when Obama acquiesces and shows his birth certificate, where he is indeed American, the president says, well, that must be a hoax and it must be fake, right? The Pizzagate scandal with the Clintons and Hillary Clinton in the basement and pedophilia. He's also fed them a consistent diet of, Democrats are somehow attached to pedophiles. The difference is Jeffrey Epstein, this isn't a conspiracy theory. He was convicted for being inappropriate with minors. And so now that he has fed this base for many, many years, certain narratives, he wants to walk away, and they're not willing to walk away. And so I think what's been interesting about this particular story for a lot of journalists on both sides of the aisle is that we have not seen the base sort of disavow something that the president has said. They have moved and shifted and twisted themselves into pretzels on a dime as the president changes his whims. In this particular instance, we have a significant portion of his base who are saying, actually, I don't agree with you. I want to get to the bottom of this, whatever it is. And so it seems as though the president can't shake it. We know, obviously, the administration would like to shake it, considering they're releasing health information, which they never do about the president, as a distraction, and it hasn't distracted his base. And so we will see whether or not it's the courts, whether or not it's Congress, whether or not he can sort of keep pushing this off on Biden and Obama and the Democrats. But at some point in time, his base, a significant portion, wants some information, and he'll have to give them something.
Well, this really has become a top issue here in Washington, but also nationwide. In fact, over here in Bloomberg, we had New York City Mayor Eric Adams on the Odd Lots podcast earlier. We want to play you both a little bit of what he said about what he's looking for, what Attorney General Pam Bondi might soon be releasing or not.
I would love to see what's in those Epstein files. I think we all do. I'm eager to look at UFOs. There's so many history. I'm still trying to figure out who killed Kennedy. I look forward to seeing there's so many deep secrets in America that I think we all want to know. And it's imperative that as much as we can find out as possible.
Rick, perhaps can you shed some of your insight here? Does this have anything to do with perhaps the sticking power that we're seeing this story really have a grip on members in both parties as they try to seek more answers? Does Eric Adams' argument there have some credibility?
Not really. I mean, I too would like to see the UFOs. Whenever I'm in New York, I feel like walking around the street, I see one UFO after another. But that's, more a comment on the residents of New York. The reality is that this was really sort of a Trump instigated problem, right? And sure, there's a lot here that is disturbing to people. Court cases were tried, people were convicted. Jeffrey Epstein killed himself. And the only people who continued to talk about this wasn't necessarily the Democratic Party. It was the Republicans who said, oh, my God, they're keeping these files secret for a reason. There are all kinds of people. They implied Bill Clinton and others had exposure to this. And it was one of the classic MAGA kind of influenced messages. And we went through a lot of those over the last, 10 years. And virtually every single one of them has sort of fallen on deaf ears. And this one has gotten some new traction because the president himself has indicated a willingness to show people something that they hadn't seen before on it. It wasn't really that big an issue until, Pam Bondi said, I'm going to release these records, and then didn't release anything that wasn't already in the public domain. So they are tripping over themselves on this issue. And the reality is, I think when you look at sort of good crisis management, you tell everybody, everyone be quiet. We're going to speak with one single voice. It will be someone who is not the president of the United States, and will draw attention to only that person and only the messages that they give, and tell everyone else to be quiet. I mean, we still don't know Dan Bongino's future as deputy of the FBI, which to me is the most important thing here, because he's supposed to be running the day-to-day operations of the FBI and has somehow been embroiled in this scandal to the point where he didn't show up for work for a couple of days. Now, that is unacceptable to most taxpayers.
Well, we're also maybe wondering about Bongino's future. We're also wondering about Eric Adams, who we just heard from's future, whether or not he can end up being reelected mayor of New York City. I would point out, Christina, that on Odd Lots with Joe Weisenthal and Tracy Alloway, they talked about a lot more than just Epstein. That full conversation can be found on Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcast. But they, no surprise, talked about the mayoral race. And specifically, Adams had some choice criticism for Zohran Mamdani, who, of course, is the Democratic nominee, specifically his attitude when it comes to billionaires. You're up at Fordham. You know New York politics well, knowing Mamdani is set to meet with the House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries in New York today. What does he need to do to actually win this thing in the general, knowing it's not just Adams that he's up against, but Andrew Cuomo as well, with this weird independent factor we don't usually see?
Right. So first things first, Rick, as a native New Yorker, I would say that we are very welcoming to aliens and non-aliens, and especially to tourists from other places. So we'll just put that out there. But Zohran Mamdani, going into the general election, we have to remember it's not ranked choice voting the way we saw in the Democratic primary. He's going up against not just current Mayor Eric Adams, three-term Governor Andrew Cuomo, the Republican nominee, and also another prominent lawyer, independent nominee, Jim Walden. So there are five people currently in the race, to say nothing of all the small names that are always on a ballot. This 33-year-old state legislator, has to sort of capture the attention. I talk about this every week on my podcast, FAQ, which is the real estate community, the business community, the labor community, and the Hasidic community. Those are the four communities that can make or break a mayor's chances of getting across the finish line. And it is first past the post. It is not a 50% majority that is needed. It is whoever gets the most votes becomes the 111th mayor of New York City. And so Mamdani, who's relatively unknown to the business community, he's relatively unknown to the labor community, which is incredibly diverse. He's definitely unknown to the real estate community and also to the Hasidic community. And there are lots of conversations that he's had about Israel and domestic versus international policy that he's attempting to clarify and sort of provide more nuance. So this is, a summer where he's a fantastic campaigner, but we know that campaigning is not governance. And so part of what he's trying to do is to convince a large portion of New Yorkers that he actually can govern. We've had abysmal turnout over the past few elections where we are electing, mayors with, barely 25%. I think we will see a high turnout election just because we have Republicans who may go with the Republican nominee, Curtis Sliwa, or they may be more inclined to go with someone like Eric Adams or even an Andrew Cuomo because they think that those individuals can negotiate with Donald Trump in a better fashion.
All right, Christina Greer and Rick Davis, our political panel on this Friday edition of Balance of Power.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
A week, of course, that has been dominated by many of the headlines we've discussed so far here on Balance of Power, from what's happened legislatively in Congress to what's going on with the Jeffrey Epstein case and how that's engulfing the Trump administration. But also, of course, the ongoing saga of President Trump and his relationship to the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, and whether or not Chairman Powell is going to be safe in his job for much longer. Of course, the president suggests he does not intend at this time to fire Chairman Powell, but that is not stopping him from pressuring Powell to lower interest rates. Seems we see this every day now on Truth Social, including a post this morning. Too late, his nickname for Chairman Powell, and the Fed are choking out the housing market with their high rate, making it difficult for people, especially the young, to buy a house. He goes on to say, Tyler, that the U.S. is rocking. There is very low inflation, and we deserve to be, he says, at 1%. Of course, that is far below where the Fed funds rate currently is.
Right, and we actually had asked Joe Livornia, counselor to Secretary Bessent yesterday about this. Perhaps we'll have to see where they actually end up thinking that the Fed funds rate should shake out. But it is apparent that the administration feels bolstered by what has been positive economic data, retail sales yesterday, University of Michigan consumer sentiment today, all, of course, factors when we are talking about this pressure campaign from the White House. And actually, our colleagues earlier today on Bloomberg Television sat down with the Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller. You heard Charlie mention it earlier on surveillance. He is, of course, seen as a potential replacement for Jerome Powell, and he hinted himself that he would dissent if his colleagues end up holding rates steady in their July meeting. We want to bring you part of that conversation now, including starting out with some of his thoughts on the Trump administration's tariff policies.
Tariffs are a tax. And in public finance, you learn that you may levy a tax on a firm, but who bears the incidence or the burden of that tax? It can be a group of people or one person, not necessarily the firm. So this is what I've heard from a lot of firms. If there's a 10% tax, they'll force their suppliers to eat some of that cost. Workers may eat some of that cost in terms of less hiring and things like that. The firm will take it out of their profit margins. And then lastly, some of it will get passed on. And as I mentioned last night, I've heard this for months now. Like the rule is 10%, it's roughly, rule of thumb is a third, a third, a third. Suppliers will eat a third, firms will eat a third, consumers going to eat a third of that tariff. So if you eat a third of it and it's 10%, like I've been arguing, this is like 3/10 on the inflation rate for a few months, and that's it. And it'll persist if you do 12-month over 12-month. That base effect will not go away for a while, and then it'll just drop off a cliff. So that's why I've been arguing you want to look at like 3 months and 6 months to see if these tariff effects pop up and then go away. And so that's more critical than looking at 12 months.
Yes, but the way the president is putting these tariffs on might not match up with theory, Chris. The Smoot-Hawley tax was passed and came into effect on a certain date. The president is not yet put on most of these tariffs. They're in theory still coming, and we still haven't seen the Section 232 tariffs for the most part, the national defense tariffs that he wants to put on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals, et cetera. So if the process is stretched out, consumers could be hit by an ongoing series of tariff increases. And given what they've just been through, isn't there a danger that inflation psychology starts to seep in?
Well, that's exactly the point. All my example has been is if you put the 10% uniform tariff on and keep it roughly in that range, then what I've described is what will happen. If there's constantly a sequence of higher and higher and higher tariffs, then you are going to get this rolling potential impact on prices. That's true. If it's still just a question of delaying it, that doesn't change my argument. Whether you see the spike in July or it happens in June or August or September, When it happens is irrelevant for the economics. That's a non-starter of an argument. Firms could also just spread it out in smaller increments over several months. The total effect still ends up being the same. They just get there in a later fashion, and it'll be smaller amounts. So the bigger thing is if we just continually get another wave of tariffs, another wave of tariffs, another waves of tariffs, that's when things become more problematic, thinking about what's going to happen with inflation.
Fed Governor Christopher Waller in conversation with our colleagues on Bloomberg Surveillance, including Bloomberg's very own Mike McKee earlier today, talking about tariffs and the unknown factor that it plays, an unknown policy that exists around them, which, of course, is one of the reasons that the Federal Reserve is maintaining, at least for now, that it feels comfortable where it is, keeping rates on hold until it has more clarity around that specific element and how it will influence the economy. But of course, President Trump does not want the Fed to be on hold, as we mentioned once again today, pushing the Fed to lower interest rates. He believes the Fed should be down at 1%. That would be substantial cuts from where we are now. And we want to get into this and other issues as we turn now to Natasha Sarin. She's professor at Yale Budget Lab, former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy, and former counselor to the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, at the Treasury Department. Natasha, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. When we consider the president, who in that Truth Social post, as he pushed for a 1% Fed funds rate, talked about how that rate would save the U.S. $1 trillion a year in terms of the interest payments that we have to make. Is that really how it will work in reality? If that is the narrative he is pushing, the Fed cuts rates, it makes our financial situation fiscally as a nation much easier?
So the challenge that we kind of have to grapple with is that the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve's independence is really crucial to the role that it's able to play in the economy as a stabilizer. So when the Federal Reserve makes decisions, it has two things in mind. It has what does the employment picture look like and what does inflation look like? And it's reacting to those two particular, really substantive data questions. If you're in a universe where instead a Federal Reserve that's become politicized is reacting to what President Trump thinks that the interest rates should be, well, in that situation, you kind of break the relationship between what the Federal Reserve actually gets to set, which is the federal funds rate, the rate at which banks lend to one another, and things like mortgage rates or car loan rates or small business loan rates that are like actually relevant to consumers in this economy. So perversely, by sort of trying to push so aggressively for an interest rate that is way outside of the realm of what any economic observers think makes sense in an environment where employment is basically at 4-ish% and inflation is still not back to target and in fact ticking upward because of this tariff policy, you really don't have any case to make for those type of rate choices outside of just politicization of the Federal Reserve, which comes with real risks.
I'm also hoping, Natasha, that you can give us a little bit more context here, too, because we have to keep in mind that the Fed chair is only one vote on the Federal Open Market Committee. And we did speak to Bill Pulte, the head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, who told us earlier this week on Balanced Power that they are seeking for Powell to step down as chair, but also his position on the board. Can you just give us a little bit, could this complicate the administration's ultimate goal here when you do have other members who are voting and what we are hearing from those other members when it does come to the future of rate cuts?
And, you know, it's like really important for your viewers, I think, and listeners to understand, like, there is no sort of button that the Fed chair pushes to change the interest rate. The way that it works, as you're describing, is the Federal Reserve chair is one of 12 members on the Federal Open Markets Committee that makes decisions. They meet 8 times a year. They make decisions on the trajectory of the interest rate. And importantly, these are decisions that are made by a group of people. And so the Fed chair, even if the president was effective at getting a Fed chair in who was going to push for his desired rate cuts that he's sort of trying to effectuate from the top in ways that break Federal Reserve independence, well, the rest of the board is going to be in a situation, and the rest of the committee is going to be in a situation where they're actually trying to push against exactly that impulse because they want to preserve the independence of the Federal Reserve, both because they are sort of institutionally very concerned about it, but also because only then can we be in a situation where we are actually trusted and credible as being reactive to inflation and being reactive to the employment picture. And what's important for your viewers, listeners also to understand is, like, we in some sense have run this experiment before. Like, President Nixon put a ton of pressure on the Federal Reserve to cut rates in ways that would be short-term politically expedient. They did. And as a result of that, you saw inflation tick up from 3% to 13% over the course of 2 years in ways that required a massive course correction and led to a significant downturn. So, like, I don't think anyone should be rooting for that in this country. And it certainly goes against what the Trump administration is hoping to see from an economic perspective.
Yeah, the historical context is important to keep in mind here, Natasha, and I appreciate you pointing that out. As you talk about the idea of trust and credibility for the Federal Reserve, I also wonder about the trust and credibility of the president as we consider his very frequently changing deadlines when it comes to tariff and trade policy, because this is what the Fed is having to contend with, why it makes their decision-making perhaps so hard. How do you at Budget Lab even try to game out the tariffs and the likely revenue we are going to be getting from them when the deadlines keep moving and the numbers keep changing? Is it even really possible to model?
I mean, we are doing our best. My colleagues and I at the Budget Lab are sort of tracing every single twist and turn with respect to tariff policy in this country. And, you know, to our count, we've seen the effective tariff rate change like almost 60 times over the course of the last several months as a result of the president's different political policies that have been pursued in this trade war. The thing that I think is like really important to grapple with, and you heard actually Governor Waller say a version of this, you've heard Chair Powell say a version of this as well. The president's been like super specific. He would like to see interest rates lower. Sort of Chair Powell and the rest of the Fed have been pretty specific as well that in a world in which this sort of uncertainty associated with trade policy didn't exist, the Federal Reserve would have already cut. And so you're in a world where it is hard in some sense to even game out what exactly the tariffs are meant to be for. Are they tools for revenue raising? Are they sort of important in order to balance our strategic alignment with vis-a-vis an adversary like China? Are they really about bringing manufacturing back into the United States? And the result of that is no one, you, I, and certainly not the business community, has any sense where these tariffs are actually fundamentally going to land. And that creates a difficulty that we can disagree about what the right effective tariff rate should be in the economy. But certainly this sort of start-stop that makes it impossible really to plan with any sense of where policy is ultimately going to land makes it really challenging to think, as an estimator, certainly very challenging to think about what the likely revenue consequences are going to be. But certainly as a business trying to make investment decisions makes it incredibly complicated to think about that as well.
Natasha, just in our final minute, I want to build off of this because we did see Michigan consumer sentiment for July today come in above estimates. What are we learning when there is uncertainty, though, about the consumer's tolerance here, since confidence at one point was plunging amid tariff concerns, but today's data did show it at a 5-month high?
You know, I think it's really hard to make too much out of any one particular data point. We also got data this week about inflation that showed that in certain particular industries, if you look at things like consumer electronics, or if you look at things like household furnishings, which is a category that includes furniture, industries or sub-industries where the tariffs are likely to have substantial bite, you're starting to see an uptick in prices. I don't want to make too much of any one particular data point other than to tell you that the result of our estimates at Yale Budget Lab, which are trying to stay current with respect to where the president says tariffs are going to be come August 1st, this next deadline, is that consumers are going to see a $2,800 on average decrease in their in their household income as a result of higher prices. And for the bottom of the distribution, that's on top of something that you all have been talking a great deal about, which is these important cuts to social programs like Medicaid that have been recently effectuated. Indeed. So I think there's a lot here that's pretty important.
Natasha, we have to leave it there. Natasha Sarin of Yale Budget Lab here with us on Balance of Power.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.